The next topic in our series, we've been exploring over the last few weeks the path of regular steps and also the expression of regular steps in the threefold path: ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So we've had some really good talks on ethics and meditation over the last couple of weeks. And I'm going to talk about the third stage of the path, which is wisdom, sometimes called Panna in Pali, Prajna in Sanskrit. So we'll be talking about that stage this evening. The first two stages, ethics and meditation, are in a way about cultivating what we call in Buddhism skillful mental states. Yeah, they're about cultivating skillful mental states. It's about being aware of the choices that we make in our everyday life and the consequences of those choices, whether they lead to happiness or whether they lead to some kind of suffering or frustration or conflict. So when we're going about our daily lives, being aware of ethics, the 5 precepts, is really useful because it gives us a framework to make wiser choices that might lead to a more harmonious and happier experience in time. And of course, when we meditate, we're actually experiencing, in a sense, our mind as a consequence of all the choices that we made in our everyday life. So meditation and ethics, they kind of go together. Meditation in some ways is an expression of your everyday life. Yeah. So when you sit to meditate, and if you're having a lot of hindrances, for example, in your meditation, well, these hindrances are arising because of the choices that we've made during our everyday life. Yeah, they maybe they weren't skillful choices. And when we experience our minds, we're experiencing some of the consequences of those choices. They might be good choices, you might feel quite happy, but if they're difficult experiences, it might be that we have to look at our ethics to see if we can intensify the skillful mental states when we're meditating. And obviously there's a relationship between how we live our lives and how we meditate. And the more we become aware of what our minds are like, the more we might modify the choices that we make in our everyday life, which would then support an intensification of meditation in the future. So meditation is not separate from how we live, yeah. Wisdom, in a way, is the topic I'm talking about tonight. Wisdom is it's like the sort of fruit of the path. It's like it seems like a different stage of the path. It feels like wisdom is the kind of result of the path, if you like. We know when we see an image of the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, perhaps as a traditional image. We see a figure of a man who's fully awakened, who's fully dwelling in wisdom, who's fully liberated. But with wisdom, we can't separate it from the other two stages. Yeah, ethics and meditation are ethics and meditation are absolutely essential to wisdom. So although wisdom is the kind of the fruition of the path, it's completely interconnected with the other two stages of ethics and meditation. You could see that wisdom's like the flower that's blossoming. It's very beautiful and attractive, but of course the flower can't blossom without the stem of the plant, and it can't blossom without the earth. So we can't force the flower to blossom prematurely. We can't just bypass ethics and meditation and go straight to wisdom. All three are in relationship together. So in a sense, we're always practicing all three at the same time. So yeah, we don't have to wait till we've perfected, if you like, ethics and meditation before we move on to wisdom. We practice all three aspects of the path at the same time, and they affect each other. Yeah. Typically, Westerners, we tend to most of us tend to go into the threefold path at the stage of meditation. Yeah, that's often what attracts us. we want to learn to meditate, and then we learn to meditate, we notice the benefits, and then when we want to take it deeper, we realize we have to look at ethics, and we also have to look at wisdom to take it deeper. So it brings the other two in. It's not everyone's like that, but it's, you know, it's quite common. That was certainly how it was for me. It's certainly how it was for a lot of people that I know. We start off with meditation, and then we pick up the other two stages later. Similarly with, in Asia, in the East, they tend to come in at the stage of ethics. So they tend to come in at the stage of ethics, and that's usually expressed in terms of service. So someone will, you know, serve the teacher perhaps, or serve the monastery that they're staying in for a long time, and then learn to meditate after perhaps years of serving the Dharma. So there's different ways in, but ultimately you need all three stages of the path to make progress. But it's interesting that you know, there's different temperaments will maybe start with a different phase of the path. So Bhante's always, Sangharakshita, the founder of our movement, he's always taught ethics, meditation, wisdom. That's the traditional teaching. Interestingly enough, for Sangharakshita, he started with wisdom, you could argue. When you read his life story, you probably, some of you will be aware of this, when he became a Buddhist, it happened at the stage of wisdom. You could say it happened at the highest level of the path, was at the beginning for Sangharakshita. It was a bit unusual. When he was 16, he went to a second-hand bookshop in Tooting Broadway in London, where he lived, and he happened to come across two Buddhist sutras. One was a Diamond Sutra, and the other was the Platform Sutra of Wei Neng. And he read these and immediately had an awakening experience, an experience of the transcendental, an experience of wisdom with a capital W. And he said in his memoirs that awakening experience never left him. It never left him, and remained fresh as it did on the day it happened throughout the whole of his life. He lived till he was 93. So there's this sense for me about wisdom, you know, with a capital W, is outside time. Of course, it's always fresh. Of course, it could never leave you in a certain sense, because it's sort of beyond the conditioned experience of the normal, of the ordinary mind. At the same time, I'm going to contradict myself here. At the same time, we need the path of regular steps. So it happens like the Sangharakshita, he started with wisdom rather than ethics meditation. But to integrate that experience into your life, you need to know how to practice ethics and meditation. Because if you only have wisdom, there is some dangers with that, in terms of your ego is quite slippery. Our egos are quite slippery. So we could have a big experience of awakening, but if we haven't got the maturity, the emotional maturity, the integration, the ethical maturity, our egos can appropriate that experience, and we could become quite big-headed, which is the opposite of what we want. Or if you haven't got enough integration, you could feel quite psychologically imbalanced by the experience. So we always have to come back to all three stages of the path. I've read stories where, like, a plumber, for example, an ordinary bloke, has had a spontaneous awakening experience, but he didn't have the context of ethics and meditation in which to make sense of it. So it kind of just became a memory of some sort, and you know, and couldn't impact his life in a full way. So there's an interesting tension between wisdom and the other two stages. So you could say that the path of regular steps, the path of ethics, meditation, wisdom, it's always useful to have all three. It's not just about letting go of the first two stages and getting to the last stage. You need all three. It's interesting with the Buddha, fully enlightened, but was always incredibly ethical after his enlightenment, very, very ethical. always meditated. So the three are all go hand in hand. Yeah. So wisdom, coming back to wisdom, we're talking about Buddhist wisdom, but we have our own wisdom traditions in the West, don't we? It's wisdom's it's a quality we don't really talk about that much explicitly. It's not something you see on TV very often. You don't see it on the soap operas very often. It's a very subtle kind of quality, but it's a very important quality. And in a way, it's the most meaningful and the most important quality of a human being, I would say. The little glimpses that I've had of wisdom over the years, I've been practicing for over 30 years, have been the most important experiences in my life. It's a bit like my mind is like a cloudy Scottish sky. It hasn't seen the sun for a long time. And then suddenly there was a little opening in the clouds and some sun comes through, and that's the wisdom. And it's like, oh my God, the sun is there. It's always been there. And then, of course, the clouds come back over and cover it up. But those glimpses of something beyond the clouds, in other words, beyond the ordinary reactive mind, give you a lot of confidence that what the Buddha is talking about, what the Buddha is pointing to, is there. And that changes your relationship to the path that he's taught, changes your relationship to your potential that's there, it's dormant. But it gives you the confidence to keep practicing because you've had these glimpses of something much more important. In our culture, we have our own wisdom traditions. We have, I remember when I used to go to Sunday school as a child, we'd be talk about the wisdom of Solomon, for example. People would come to Solomon in the Old Testament and they'd have all sorts of problems and you'd have to try and help them to solve them. There's the ancient Greek traditions, which is very, very rich. You've got Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, Marcus Aurelius, with his Stoic philosophy. They're still very popular to this day, all these wisdom traditions. People buy them, they read them on the train when they're traveling to work. They've still got a lot of juice to them. There's also psychology, which has been big since the 20th century. There's a lot of wisdom in that as well. And of course, there's folk wisdom, which, I remember my dad used to say to me when I was moaning about things to him, he would say, well, it's a long road that doesn't have a turning, son, he'd say that to me. It's a long road that doesn't have a turning. There's this sense of that things will always change at some point, yeah. So you get these little aphorisms of old folk wisdom that kind of are quite helpful for changing perspective on a problem. And I think this is what wisdom's really about. It's about giving us a bigger perspective on our experience so that we can make sense of the problems, of the suffering that we experience in our lives, yeah? So I think this is why wisdom's important. It might not be very explicit in our culture, but we all kind of value it, when we get good advice from a friend or a family member, or we read something really powerful and meaningful, there's depth there. And I think wisdom has this quality of depth. And that changes our consciousness so that we see the problem from a bigger perspective. And then suddenly we can start to change it for the better. So this is the value of wisdom. Buddhist wisdom is incredibly rich. I mean, it's been such a blessing to have Buddhist wisdom in my life. The words of the Buddha are incredible. They're so deep, they're so useful, they're so practical. I reflect on the Buddha's words, pretty much every day, and it's had so much relevance to sorting out suffering in my life. I feel so grateful to have been able to receive the teaching of the Buddha and apply it to my life. It's made a huge, huge difference, yeah. And the Buddha himself was facing some of these deep problems, these deep conflicts. He actually had a very cushy, what you might call quite a cushy life. He was a prince. He lived quite a luxurious life. He didn't really lack for anything at the time that he was in India 2,500 years ago or so. He had a lot of pleasure. He had a lot of opportunity. He had status, all these sources of what we usually think is, real happiness. But he wasn't satisfied. He had a kind of existential questioning of that, which led him to give it all up and become a wandering religious spiritual seeker looking for the deeper truth. Yeah. So all that wisdom that the Buddha has passed on to us comes from his own search, his own deep questioning, his own search for a bigger perspective for his questions. Yeah, a bigger perspective for his questions. He was looking for the deathless. That's how they talked about it back then in ancient India. He was looking for the deathless, release from the round of suffering. Yeah. So this is the culmination. The Buddha practiced for many, many years under different teachers. He learned very deep meditation from many of the Hindu teachers at the time. I don't know if they used the term Hindu, but the yogic traditions of the time before Buddhism were very, very helpful for the Buddha. He got into incredibly deep meditations, and that changed his consciousness. It gave him a bigger perspective, but he still felt something was missing. Still felt something was missing, which is what led him on to discovering for himself the Buddhist path to enlightenment. For the Buddha, he talked about liberation as being knowledge and vision of things as they really are. Knowledge and vision of things as they really are. And it's a progressive path to wisdom. So although sometimes a few people have this sudden, like Sangharakshita, they have this sudden awakening, most people go through a kind of progressive stages of the path to wisdom, to seeing things as they are. So that involves looking at suffering, getting confident that there is some sunlight that can come through the clouds. That gives you more confidence in the path. That leads to a different kind of positive emotion, joy, happiness, even bliss can arise from that, which leads to a very deep absorption in meditation. And on the basis of that deep absorption in meditation, reflecting on the nature of reality, which I'm going to come to in a second, that gives rise to knowledge and vision of things as they are. So there's this progressive sequence of stages towards wisdom, what the Buddha teaches. So the main teaching that one has to talk about around wisdom is the three marks of conditioned existence. That's what I'm going to talk about a little bit this evening. They're called the three lakshanas. Many of you will be very familiar with them. They are being aware of suffering, impermanence, and no self, anatta it's called, which is quite a complex mark of conditioned existence, which I'll go into as well. So there's these three marks of conditioned existence. And it's basically the Buddha saying, if you want to progressively develop wisdom, you need to start learning to see your experience in these three ways. Yeah. So seeing in these ways, we start to experience freedom. So in a way, he's trying to teach us how to see with freedom. Yeah. So let's go into this a little bit more deeply so we can try and understand what the Buddha was pointing to. So the first one is suffering. So the Buddha is saying, if you want to gain wisdom, you have to look clearly at the nature of suffering. Now, this is not a very popular thing to do on the surface of things. And sometimes it can be a bit of a barrier to people engaging with Buddhism because they think it sounds a bit pessimistic. It can sound a bit joyless, you know. But what the Buddha is really trying to do is trying to get us to have an honest appraisal of what our pleasures are and whether they're really reliable. Yeah, whether they're really reliable. It's quite important. It doesn't mean that pleasure is bad or unreal. It's just basically being very, very realistic about the nature of suffering. Yeah. I remember quite a few years ago when I was really young, in my early 20s, and I was doing my first solitary retreat, and I was doing it up in the Highlands, and I was working in an office at the time in Glasgow, and I wasn't so tactful then, and I just said to my team, you know, I'm going off to do a solitary retreat in the Highlands, and quite a lot of people said to me, why would you want to do that sort of thing? And they asked me whether I had a TV and what I was going to do, and I said nothing. I'm just going to be in this cottage on my own. I'm going to read and meditate and live a very simple retreat life. And they just thought it was crazy. There's no TV, there was no activities I was doing. I wasn't going hill walking, I wasn't going to pubs and stuff. And they just thought, God, why would you want to do that? It sounded terrible. It sounded like so joyless, But it was actually one of the most joyful and positive experiences of my life. I still reminisce about that week up in the Highlands. I really experienced the power of meditation. And I really experienced the joy of being aware of one's mind and cultivating positive emotions. And it was really, really great. But it was so hard to convince my teammates that that was really the case. So yeah, it's a tricky one. So it's not about being miserable. Buddhism's not about being miserable. It's not a badge of spiritual progress to be miserable. But sometimes when you read what the Buddha says about suffering, it can seem a bit, a bit like that to some people. Yeah. Paradoxically, the more we actually face the reality of suffering, the more joyful we actually feel. This is to do with what the natural human tendency to want to avoid pain and just keep the pleasure. It's a very human tendency. We all do it. I do it. Everyone I know does it. And we don't want to look deeply at it. We just want to escape from it. But if we want to liberate the energies that are caught up in that dynamic of avoidance, we have to face the truth of our suffering and that avoidance. So the Buddha gives us a few helpful pointers about this. He said there's 3 types of suffering. There's what he calls actual suffering, which is like just the fact that we get ill, we get sick, we stub our toe, it's painful, we get COVID for a couple of weeks, it's rubbish. The body sometimes gives us a lot of pain. It gives us a lot of pleasure as well, but it gives us pain. And we can't do anything about that. Even the Buddha, who was awakened, got bad backs. He had to get Ananda, his friend, to massage his back. It was really painful as he got older. He got dysentery towards the end of his life, and it was a really, really bad. They say he was racked with pain from the dysentery, really awful dysentery. And the Buddha just had to bear it. So the Buddha wasn't free from just ordinary suffering, physical suffering. It happens to us all. It's the nature of being a human being and having a body. But there's 2 other kinds of suffering that the Buddha talked about, and he said that these can be overcome. And the first one is what's called potential suffering. So a good example is, I was on holiday, in Spain recently with my partner. We're having a lovely time on the beach. But then, when it gets to the end of the holiday, you're like, oh no, I've got to go back to work. And so there's always a sense that even when you're enjoying something, it's going to change, and you'll probably experience some suffering. And usually the first couple of days when I come back from a beach holiday or something, there's always an element of, feeling a bit miffed about it, And it's like that with a lot of things. You might have a great job, career, you might have great friends, you might have a great partner, you might be able to have loads of pleasurable experiences, but they will end, or they could change. And so there's always this part of you knows that they will change or end. And that is a form of suffering, That's another kind of form of suffering. He calls it potential suffering. So there's always this potential for change. And of course we get attached to the pleasure, and we don't want it to change, And this was the Buddha, luxurious life in the kingdom, lots of pleasures, but he was aware of this level of dukkha, the level of potential change. It wasn't enough. And then lastly, the Buddha talks about the suffering of conditioned existence itself, is what he calls it. You could call it existential suffering. It's just inherent in being a human being. And it's inherent in not being enlightened, not being fully enlightened, because there's something within us wants to grow. Yeah. And it won't be fully satisfied, even with pleasurable experiences of being on holiday, having great friends, having a great career. It won't be fully satisfied with these things. There's something deeper than all that that needs expression. It's something in us, there's a drive within us that wants to grow and develop to its full potential, which the Buddha says is awakening. And if that doesn't get expression, there'll be this underlying dissatisfaction, even though you might be having a series of really great experiences. There'll be something perhaps missing. You might not notice it for a long time, but it will be there. It can't fully deliver. So these are the three pointers that the Buddha gives us around dukkha. As I say, sometimes a bit of a barrier for some people looking directly at suffering. But actually what I found about it is it's made me more real. Yeah, and there's something really honest and real about being able to look at suffering and get out of that dynamic of avoiding and not talking about suffering, not talking about the realities of it. There's something quite liberating about that level of truth and honesty. And it's a bit like doing a really good therapy session, you know, when you've kind of really got down to bedrock around some of your defenses, some of the ways that you avoid the truth of what you are. And the therapist is gently bringing you back to that, holding up the mirror. And then the penny drops, and it's painful, but you're kind of glad that you're finally acknowledging the truth of yourself and the truth of what you do. And maybe that's an inherited thing from parents and everything, but it releases it. And that's kind of similar, I think, to what the Buddha is getting at with this mark of conditioned existence. Yeah. So there's a lot to say about that, but I'll leave it there and move on to the next mark of conditioned existence, which is impermanence. Yeah. Very, very important. The Buddha said if you could boil his teaching down to just one word, it would be impermanence. Yeah. So that's important to know, isn't it? Now, there's also a story about a kind of monk who was wasn't very clever. He was a bit stupid, it said in the suttas, the early stories. And I really like this stupid monk, but the only piece of Dharma that he could remember was impermanence. He couldn't remember, you know, whole suttas. He couldn't even remember a verse, but he could remember this one word, impermanence, and that led him to release. The Buddha says that if you meditate deeply enough on impermanence, it will lead to a liberation called the signless. Yeah, a liberation called the signless. If you penetrate deeply enough into the truth of impermanence, you will liberate into the signless samadhi, the signless concentration. It's a very powerful, very very deep state of mind. Yeah. This. So the Buddha says we need to start paying attention to change. We need to notice change. We need to see the universality of change. And we need to just start off by noticing it, maybe with the change of the seasons. We need to notice it in the changes of our bodies. We notice it, you know, in other ways as well. You know, sometimes when you look at old photos and you see the you know, the trousers and the shorts you used to wear, and you're like, oh my God, did I really wear that? And at the time you thought it was the coolest thing ever. And now it just looks terrible, doesn't it? And you feel really uncool when you see yourself and you don't want other people to see it, and you're deleting all your photos. You're so embarrassed about them. It's impermanence, isn't it? It's impermanence. And this is happening all the time. You know, it's really interesting going to old ancient ruins. A few years back, I went to Rome, incredible city to visit, you know, so much history, and going to the Colosseum and all these other ancient ruins. And at the time, people probably thought this would last forever, you know, and now it's a ruin and we're just walking about it. Imagine in the future, I don't know how far in the future, Buckingham Palace, imagine that being a ruin and people are just going to it as if it's a museum piece. It could happen, it might happen. You know, the people in Rome thought the Colosseum would probably last forever. We think Buckingham Palace might last forever. but it might not. 2,000 years time, people might be going to this ruin of Buckingham Palace and talking about this royal family that used to be in England and stuff, and you just don't know, do we? But it's just, it gets you thinking, doesn't it, about change and impermanence. So we need to notice change and all its manifestations. This is what the Buddha is encouraging us to do. If we want to develop wisdom, we've got to notice impermanence and change. And it's not easy, because we don't want things to change. We want to keep the pleasure and we want to avoid the pain. Yeah. So we want things to kind of stay permanent, as long as they're pleasurable. If they're painful, of course you want change, but if they're pleasurable, you don't. And also there's this interesting thing, because there's someone we call a perceiver, perceiving things change. So we see the fireworks, up in the sky, and they arise, and then we think, oh, that's impermanent, and it's gone back into the darkness again. But who is this person that's perceiving that fireworks impermanence? That person is also impermanent as well. And that's when it starts to get quite mind-blowing, when you start to reflect on the observer is also impermanent, So we suffer, the Buddha says, because we regard things that are impermanent as permanent. Yeah, we regard things that are actually subject to change. We think they'll last forever. Yeah, this is happening all the time, and it causes us a lot of suffering. And of course, we build our happiness, our emotional lives are built on, a sense that our attachments to people, to places, to experiences, and to personal identity will last forever. And when it changes, we can feel suffering, because we don't want that change to happen. So that doesn't mean that we don't form deep connections with people because we're worried about attachment. That doesn't mean that we avoid loving others. No, but we try to purify our love and our connections with others and we do that by becoming more aware of impermanence, so that we love, connect fully, and we also let go. We also accept that things change. It's very, very hard to do, but it's possible. So we need to love more purely, you could say, more purely. See through our attachments and dependencies, see how we build our happiness around people, identities, and sometimes these change, and they will change. Paradoxically, like suffering, the more that we accept the deep truth of impermanence, and don't feel so dependent on things being fixed in a certain way, we're freer to love and accept change and be more open and sensitive and clear and more connected. So it's a big part of metta is being open to change and impermanence, and allowing change and impermanence to happen, and accepting that. And then we come to the last of the marks of conditioned existence, which is anatta, which literally means no self. So no fixed self. It's quite a difficult thing to talk about. I find that particular mark of conditioned existence. It's sometimes helpful to understand the religious context of the time where the Buddha was. The yogic meditative context was what you'd call eternalistic. So there was this belief that it was Atman, which means self, but it's not just self in a kind of personal sense. It's like everything is self, all experience, all phenomena are self. So it's kind of like everything becomes one. It's a sort of kind of mysticism. And that was, it's a very deep, quite attractive teaching in a lot of ways. I definitely feel a resonance with that teaching, but it's not a full awakening in the Buddhist sense. Because there's still this sense of the one has a permanence to it, and that is a barrier to full awakening. So in a kind of theoretical sense, the Buddha was refuting this religious tendency to see everything as just all one, everything as being Atman, he said that wasn't the way to the truth that he taught. On a personal level, and this is more useful, it's more to do with the sense of identification that we have. We have the sense of ourselves, a story, a history, things that we like, things that we don't like, things that we're good at, the jobs we do, the type of people we are. And if that, if you notice times when you get a bit touchy, say like I'm Scottish, and if somebody sort of teases me about being Scottish, I can feel this, little bit of touchiness goes on, because I've been conditioned to identify with being from a particular part of the British Isles called Scotland, and all that goes with that. And it's a bit strange, isn't it, to kind of be kind of identified with something like that, and then if somebody kind of doesn't agree with it or whatever, you feel touchy about it, or and what is that touchiness? What is that touchiness? About where you're identified with something. And of course, we saw that with Brexit, didn't we? It was incredibly divisive back in 2016. People that were voting to leave, people that were voting to stay. Two different sets of people completely identifying with quite a particular position. It all got very personal. And what the Buddha is saying is, look at those moments where things get personal. Look at those moments where you identify with something really strongly and get touchy. That's that tendency to self, create a self. And so the Buddha is saying to us, if you want to be free from suffering, if you want to be awakened, you've got to loosen up that tendency to be, identify the self too strongly, because it'll just lead to a lot of suffering, So that's how I relate to this lakshana of an Atman. But also without that lakshana of an Atman or no self, you couldn't have growth. The Buddha teaches us that we can grow and develop, we can become more of an individual, we can develop qualities, and maybe in the past, one might have been quite grumpy, and then a few years of practicing metta bhavana, you start to become more loving and open. That's because yourself can change. You can grow, you can change. If that was permanent, you wouldn't be able to change. So it's to do with, it validates the path of growth and development. This lakshana. We don't have a fixed self. We can all change. And also just to say that sometimes when people hear this thing about no self, they think, they sometimes find it kind of like they're attracted to it for the wrong reason. They think they can get rid of their sense of self, get rid of their history. They don't exist. That's a wrong view, and it's a very dangerous view to have, because it's going to lead to alienation. So no fixed self, and Atman doesn't mean that you don't have a rich inner life, that you don't have a kind of sense of soulfulness. My experience of practicing Buddhism, having a meditation practice, is that I'm more in touch with my inner life than I've ever been. It's more richer, it's more alive. So actually, this whole thing about not having any self and blanking yourself out and becoming some zombie or something is a misunderstanding of the Buddhist teaching there. So these are the three ways that the Buddha is encouraging us to progressively develop wisdom, see suffering more realistically, be more realistic about the sources of our pleasure, look at that dynamic of avoiding suffering and just trying to escape it into, in a way, superficial pleasures that don't really deeply satisfy. He's asking us to look at impermanence, to really see it clearly, this principle of change in our lives. Notice how things change. Notice how we build our happiness on things being permanent all the time, and yet that can never really be true. It's always going to change. Can we open to a bigger sense of mind, a more creative sense of mind, a more open sense of mind, where we can love, connect, and build happiness and accept that it will change as well. And then lastly, there's this whole area of identification, a fixed self. Can we let go of that tendency to be touchy, to take things personal, to identify with certain things really, really rigidly in a way that creates division, conflict within ourselves and with others, that creates suffering, yeah. So it's a massive area, these three lakshanas. They're very, very core to Buddhism, but they do lead to this deeper experience of emotional freedom, deeper experience of positive emotion, and also to knowledge and vision of things as they really are, is what the Buddha called it, knowledge and vision of things as they really are. And if we progressively try to perceive our experience in these three ways, we'll start to feel more free in our lives. Yeah, doesn't mean it'll necessarily always be easy, but there's a certain satisfaction of seeing how you used to be maybe several years ago and how you seem to be now. You're noticing you're more patient, you're noticing you're less reactive, you're noticing you're more accepting, noticing that you're more loving, but also in a way that accepts change, yeah. So that's probably enough. I've run out of time. I was going to say a little bit about 3 levels of wisdom, but I think I'll knock it on the head there, because that's enough to be getting on with. I do have a few questions for the group, or maybe a couple of groups. I'm not sure how we'll do it yet after the tea break. But maybe these are just things to think about. What are the sources of wisdom in your life? As I say, you know, Buddhism hasn't got an exclusive branding on wisdom. We've all been exposed to wisdom in our lives, you know, from all sorts of different sources. I wonder what the sources of wisdom have been in your life so far. Maybe it's Buddhist, maybe it's something else, but it's all got some value, isn't it? Why would you, or do you want to develop wisdom? You know, as I was saying at the beginning of my talk, it's not something that you sort of talk about very explicitly. I find, you know, it's not something that's in the air particularly explicitly, and yet my own experiences of wisdom is one of the most important qualities I've ever encountered, and yet we don't really talk about it. It's weird, isn't it? So what about you? Why do you want to develop wisdom? Do you want to develop wisdom? And then lastly, where do you notice or not notice the marks of conditioned existence in your everyday life? Do you face suffering? Do you bring awareness into it, or do you notice you avoid it? Where do you avoid it and where don't you avoid it? That sort of thing. Do you open yourself up to change and impermanence? That kind of stuff. So probably enough to get our teeth into for the groups, yeah. Obviously, if you've got other questions, bring them to the group, yeah. So I think we'll stop there and have a tea break, yeah.
Thanks very much.